Hello, welcome to the Glazov Gang. I'm Lionheart, sitting in once again for Jamie Glazov. And once again, our guest is Mr. Anthony Rogers, joining us via Skype. And in our first interview with Mr. Rogers, we learned what the Islamic materials are that make up the Islamic community, that make up Islamic jurisprudence. Well, now he's back to show us some application, how these materials are used, how we can use them when we speak to Muslims, or when we speak on the subject of Islam, be it theological or political. It is very good for us to have that foundation and understanding of the sources that make up this worldview that is so dominant in the world today. Mr. Anthony, welcome back to the Glazov Gang. How are you today?
Thank you, Louis. I'm doing great. Thank you again for having me on.
Fantastic. Anthony, let's just get right into it. I really appreciate our previous interview. That was very helpful, and I'm sure our guests will now have a better understanding of these materials that make up this worldview that is on the news almost on a daily basis. How can we now introduce these materials when we speak to somebody on the subject of Islam and come to a right understanding of who is properly representing the religion or the worldview, and at the same time reconcile that with one of these quotes that I found in one of these hadith references that says this: the Prophet said, controverting about the Quran is disbelief. It seems to me that arguing about the Quran or disagreeing about the Quran would constitute disbelief in Muhammad's eyes. So the fact that there are so many sects of Islam that argue amongst themselves, how do we from the outside determine who is truly representing the religion? Is it ISIS? Is it our moderate Muslims that we see here in the West? Is it somewhere in between? Is it cultural Islam? What do the materials that we know as Hadith, the Quran, the Sirah, the materials you introduced in our previous interview, what do they say as far as what true Islam is?
Right. Well, if we take a particular issue, say wife beating, which is obviously a very important issue. It's something that ought to be of importance to people. And it's a very serious difference between Western culture and Middle Eastern culture, or cultures dominated by Islam. Here, in our Western context, we often hear that the Quran is against wife beating, and you'll hear others in a Middle Eastern context saying it isn't. And then both are vying for, everybody's attention. They want everybody to agree with their side and so forth. And applying what we learned last time, what we would do is we would go to the Islamic sources and we would simply ask, what does the Quran say about this issue? Then we would see if there's any further light shed upon this in the Hadith literature. And then we would see if there's any further light shed upon it in the tafsir, and then in the Sirah literature, the biographical material on Muhammad. And on this issue, we have a whole wealth of material that we could look to. You've probably heard, and others perhaps as well, Muslims will, for example, the verse in Surah 4:34 of the Quran, which is commonly pointed to justify wife beating. You'll hear some Muslims say that the beating there just refers to lightly tapping them. Some will say with a miswak, which is sort of like a toothpick. And it's supposed to just be sort of a psychological chastisement to the wife if she's done wrong. It'd be like two men in a gentlemanly way slapping the other on the face with a glove, is sort of the way that some Muslims would want us to interpret that verse. Well, here, you could get very technical and you can say, look here, the word that's used in the Quran means beat. That's the way it's used in the lexical sources. That's the way it's used throughout the Quran. And so it doesn't mean lightly tap or anything. Or you could turn from that to the Hadith, where you have particular instances. I don't know if you want me to get into those, but you have particular instances of people being beaten and descriptions given where you can tell it's not simply referring to somebody being tapped, a woman being tapped by her husband. And then you can find the same thing, over again in the tafsir and in the Sirah literature. So that would be one area where you could apply this very fruitfully and see who's got the right idea on their side.
And how do we know that that's not just historical narrative, but that it's something that a Muslim is to emulate, so that if he does not follow in those footsteps that we see Muhammad walking in or his successors, that they themselves are actually in violation of Islamic law?
Well, that's actually, from my perspective, a two-pronged question in a sense. There's a question of whether or not these sources are trustworthy, whether or not we can trust them. And then there's the question of what is definitional of Islam. Muslims believe these sources are trustworthy. They believe the Quran is from Allah, the Hadith is from Muhammad, and the tafsir, if it's accurately drawing from the Hadith, is reliable and so forth. So if we're simply looking at these things the way a Muslim would in order to determine what Islam is, then that's how we know that this is legitimate. It's every group has the right to define itself, but they have to do so according to their own standards. Internally it has to be consistent. And classically, Islam is a religion that believes in the Quran, in the Hadith, or the traditions of Muhammad, and in these authoritative tafsirs. And so anybody who's going to set up a different standard really doesn't have the right to just say that's Islam. They can call it their own religion, they can call it something else. That's what many groups have done. And they can do that. I don't think they should call themselves Muslims. But those who do call themselves Muslims are simply going by the sources when they do the things that they do. Was that an answer to your question?
Yeah, and well, the Quran, is it the Quran that says that Muhammad is a beautiful pattern of conduct, so that Muslims will appeal to that as looking at the life of Muhammad? And you mentioned the Sirah literature previously as being that which is biographical. That being the case, a Muslim that sees something within that material and emulates it, even if it's incompatible with Western cultures, Western constitutions, Western law, how does a Muslim living in the West reconcile his obedience and desire to emulate Muhammad and the contradiction with a Western constitution, government, or law?
Well, they could do it in a variety of ways. One of the best ways is simply to be ignorant of the sources. So you'll often have Muslims saying, I believe the Quran, I believe the Hadith, I believe the tafsirs, and so forth, but not knowing a lick of what they say. And those have a much easier time doing this. Others have to be more creative. If they're inclined to try and fit in with Western culture, they'll have to try and engage in reinterpretation. They'll have to try and make these sources mean what they want, and sometimes they'll play fast and loose with the sources. They'll say, this source is not reliable, that doesn't really come from Muhammad, and so forth. But those Muslims who don't really care to capitulate or to bow to Western culture, they want to be obedient to Allah and follow Muhammad, those Muslims are going to take a harder approach to this and basically follow Muhammad at the expense of offending Westerners. And those who do so to the hilt are going to be those who, say, in our military, decide to turn and start shooting people, or those who stand on the side of freeways and, like snipers, start shooting people. I mean, those are the people who want to seriously follow Muhammad, no matter what the culture thinks or no matter what might happen to them. They're ultimately thinking of what they're going to get in Jannah, or paradise, and don't really care what might happen to them here.
Thank you. And within Islam, there is a doctrine of deception. I believe the proper way of pronouncing it is taqiyya. Is this something that we should be aware of and understand the theological and religious aspects from the sources that we just mentioned, in order for us to not be deceived by somebody who's professing to be a Muslim and yet seemingly contradicting the things we know about Islam?
Yeah, that's actually, I'm glad you follow up with that. That's actually another way they would deal with these contradictions between what their sources say and what Western culture teaches. They might just try and do a good PR campaign and pretend that Islam teaches one thing and what really teaches another. And here, I think it's very important that you understand what Muslims believe about Allah, because that's ultimately what this all traces back to. According to the Quran, Allah is the greatest deceiver. That's found in the Quran, their primary source, Surah 354 and Surah 830. Both of those passages say Allah is the greatest deceiver. There are many other passages that call Allah a deceiver. They also use the word guile for him and other cognate terms. So Allah is where it all begins. And one of the great examples of Allah's deception is when he supposedly deceived the world into thinking that Jesus was crucified. So they even have a specific example. And there's really multiple examples of Allah engaging in deception according to the Quran as well as the Hadith literature and so forth. So Muslims, looking at the character of their God, believing that he is the one that ultimately they're obeying, would just from that alone be able to infer that it's okay to lie to your face. But they even have sayings that tell them just that. They don't even have to infer it, though that's ready to hand. But they have statements where it says, smile at their faces and curse them in your hearts, which basically means put on a false face, hypocrisy, put on a mask. That's what the word hypocrisy ultimately means. And they have other sayings like war is deception or deceit. Now, here, this statement is very interesting. If war is deceit, it's important to remember that Muslims think they're at war with everyone that's not a Muslim. And that war can be carried on through argumentation as well as through the sword. And so lying is something that a Muslim can feel free to do, and many happily do so. So that's very important to remember. They don't always have to be telling us the truth, and they don't have a guilty conscience over it. Their consciences are seared because they think their God sanctions this sort of thing. And their prophet engaged in deception. So as the perfect pattern of conduct, they would ultimately think themselves doing a good thing as opposed to a bad thing if they were lying to our faces and knowing the truth was otherwise.
Now, this makes it very difficult then to have a sincere relationship with a Muslim. Is a Muslim allowed to truly have a friendship with a non-Muslim without any intent to convert the person, to draw them to the religion, to contradict their worldview? Can there be a true friendship or alliance between a Muslim and a non-Muslim, be it personal or be it a Islamic government and a non-Islamic government?
No. The Quran itself actually says don't take the unbelievers for your friends. This is another example of what Muslims to a Western audience will often try to reinterpret, and it actually creates problems for them. Some Muslims will say that really what it means is don't take non-Muslims as your protectors. So don't create situations where you're ultimately dependent upon their aid, trust in Allah, and so forth. The problem with that is that the same word is used to refer to the friends of Allah. And so if that word just means protectors, then it means Allah has protectors. It would also mean that a Muslim couldn't appeal to the police in Western societies or other law enforcement agencies because then they would be seeking the protection of non-Muslims. So the verse says, and Muslims know this, who know their Quran, that they can't be friends with us. So every motion towards us that would appear as if they want to be friends is really just another example of that deception we're talking about. And that does make it difficult. But I do think we should temper this a bit. We should remember that these people, in spite of themselves, are human beings. And so some of them do not live, in one sense, we might want to say live up to the standards of their religion, but in this case we really should be saying live down to the standards of their religion. Some Muslims rise higher than the Quran in spite of what the Quran teaches, and so there are Muslims who would form friendships with people, but those who do so would be doing so contrary to the Quran. But again, when you've got this situation going on where this is what they're taught, this is what their sources teach, this is what many Muslims believe, it's hard to know in this kind of a situation where this person that we were talking to stands. Are they those who are rising above the Islamic sources and really want to be friends, or are they those people who really care more to follow what Muhammad taught?
So I guess it just comes down to our personal integrity of desiring the better thing for them in educating them at times of their own religion, hoping that they will have a radical change in worldviews. Isn't that the case? We just should be concerned more with ourselves then, seeing that we can't truly know the person's heart?
Well, I mean, yeah, we do have to be wise, though, and we want to be discerning. So I'd say it's just like anybody who grew up in a city or lived in a city. You want to think the best of people, but you got to be smart and recognize that there are those that are going to steal your wallet. There are those that are going to so you just exercise wisdom. Just like a person on the street would exercise street wisdom, we should exercise Islamic wisdom, I guess. Wisdom about what their sources teach, and just be aware and seek to educate them and explain to them what their sources actually teach, and hopefully make some headway or progress.
Yeah, with the limited time that we have left, Anthony, I want to thank you. I see a library behind you, and I know that if we were to get into a more in-depth discussion on this subject, it would require a host of programs. And we do want to encourage people to take the time to study the materials that were referenced. So can you go over these materials one more time by name so that a person, again, can have an understanding of what makes up the Islamic faith and how we can understand it, starting with the Quran and some of these other references. And this will help us to be able to start searching. If somebody hasn't already begun an academic study in the religion of Islam, this will give them a foundation to start with.
Right. There is, first of all, the Quran, those revelations that were supposedly brought from Jibreel, from Allah to Muhammad, and then in turn recited by Muhammad. These are supposed to be the literal verbal dictations of Allah. Then there are the inspired sayings or traditions of Muhammad, where he would explain the Quran and illustrate it in his life. And since Muslims think he's the perfect pattern of conduct, they'll comb through the material trying to see how Muhammad lived out the Quran in his life, and they'll try and imitate that to a T, all the way down to how he went to the bathroom. They will literally emulate his every step and every motion in all other respects. Then there's also the tafsir material, which is where Muslim scholars have basically gone through all of this interpretive material found in the Hadith and tried to apply it to the specific verses or the relevant verses of the Quran. And that's very valuable. It tells us the context often of when these things happened, when they were revealed, what party they were addressed to, and so forth. And then finally, there's the seerah literature, or the biographical material, which gives us more of a running narrative or story of Muhammad and fits some of these things into it. There are, of course, many other pieces of material that would be involved in getting I guess, a overall and filled in detailed understanding of Islam, but these are the main or primary sources.
Right.
And that's what your listeners would want to know about if they really want to be intelligently informed on this topic and to engage it.
Well, thank you, Anthony. We're out of time. I appreciate you coming on the show one more time. And again, can you just give your website where we can look at your articles for our audience?
Right. The website is answeringislam.org, and I'm only one of over 50 authors. And again, it also houses many classical works. So that's answeringislam.org. If you go to the left-hand column and you scroll down and you look at the link that says individual authors, there you'll find a list of names, and my name's in there, Anthony Rogers. But again, it's an incredibly vast resource. There's a lot of material to be used there. Oh, and there's a very useful search tool at the bottom of that left-hand column. If you go there and you type in a subject, you're bound to pull up something on almost anything you can think of relevant to Islam.
Thank you, Anthony, and come back another time.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all for listening and watching the program, the Glazov Gang, and we hope to have Jamie back soon to take over the helm here. Thank you very much.